The notification sound from my phone shattered the silence of my empty San Francisco apartment. I glanced at the Instagram alert and felt my world tilt sideways. There they were. My parents lounging beside an infinity pool at some luxury resort, champagne flutes raised in celebration. The caption read, "Family vacation goals, posted by my sister Brianna." I stared at the image of them basking in golden California sunshine while I sat alone with cold Chinese takeout on my 32nd birthday. This was the third major family event they had excluded me from this year. Yet somehow they always managed to afford these elaborate trips while constantly asking me for money. I set my phone down with trembling hands, but the damage was already done. The familiar ache of being invisible settled in my chest like a lead weight. For 32 years I had watched my family celebrate my younger sister Brianna while treating me like an afterthought. She was their golden child. The artistic one, the creative soul, the daughter who brought them joy and pride. At 28, Brianna still lived in our childhood bedroom in Sacramento, working part-time at a trendy gallery downtown while pursuing her passion for mixed media installations. Meanwhile, I had become the family's walking ATM. After graduating summa cum laude from Stanford with my computer science degree, I spent 5 years grinding away at tech startups before developing a revolutionary app for streamlining medical records. When Google acquired my company 2 years ago for $8 million, I thought finally, my parents would acknowledge what I had accomplished. Instead, Robert and Patricia acted like my success was some lucky accident. "Oh, Deanne just plays around with computers," my mother would tell her bridge club friends. "It's not real work like what Brianna does. Art touches people's souls." My father would nod along, dismissing years of coding, business planning, and sleepless nights as if I had simply stumbled upon a pile of money. Yet, every month without fail, they came to me with their hands outstretched. Car repairs for Dad's aging Buick, medical copays for Mom's endless doctor visits, emergency home maintenance that always seemed to coincide with Brianna's art show openings. I wrote check after check, hoping each one would buy me a seat at their table, a place in their hearts, some small recognition that I mattered. The irony wasn't lost on me that while they dismissed my achievements, they had no problem spending my earnings. Last month alone, I had transferred $3,000 to help with what they called emergency roof repairs on their craftsman-style house. Mom had called crying about water damage and potential structural issues, painting such a dire picture that I wired the money immediately without asking questions. Now, here they were, sipping champagne at what looked like an incredibly expensive resort, while I spent my birthday eating lo mein straight from the container. The vacation they were flaunting could easily cost $10,000 to $15,000 for a week at a place that luxurious. The infinity pool gleamed like liquid sapphire framed by rolling hills that screamed Napa Valley exclusivity. I scrolled through Brianna's other recent posts, each one a knife twist of family togetherness that deliberately excluded me. Photos of them exploring vineyards, dining at restaurants with white tablecloths and crystal stemware, enjoying couples massages at what appeared to be a world-class spa. The three of them looked relaxed and radiant, as if they hadn't a care in the world. But something nagged at me as I studied the images more carefully. The resort looked familiar somehow, though I couldn't place where I might have seen it before. The distinctive architecture with its blend of Mediterranean and California mission styles stirred a memory just beyond my reach. The landscaping was immaculate. Perfectly manicured gardens with lavender borders and olive trees casting artistic shadows across stone pathways. Then it hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just any expensive resort. Those weren't random vacation photos. My family was staying at the Silverstone Resort and Spa, and they were using a membership that they absolutely could not afford. The basic annual membership at Silverstone started at $25,000, with the premium packages reaching $50,000 or more. My parents, who constantly pleaded poverty and asked me to cover their basic expenses somehow, had access to one of Northern California's most exclusive retreat destinations. The betrayal cut deeper than any previous slight. Not only had they excluded me from yet another family celebration, but they had lied about needing my money for roof repairs while secretly planning this elaborate getaway. The emergency fund I had provided was probably sitting in some resort account paying for their champagne and caviar while I celebrated my birthday alone with gas station wine and regret. I paced my apartment's hardwood floors, my mind racing as pieces of a puzzle I didn't know existed began falling into place. The Silverstone Resort and Spa wasn't just familiar because I had seen it in magazines or travel websites. It was familiar because 6 months ago I had purchased it as an investment property, planning to surprise my family with the perfect Christmas vacation. The acquisition had been my secret project, something I wanted to reveal when the timing felt right. After the Google buyout, my financial advisor suggested diversifying into real estate, and when Silverstone came on the market due to the previous owner's retirement, it seemed like destiny. Not only was it a sound investment in California's thriving wine country tourism industry, but it would give my family a place where we could finally create the kind of memories that had always eluded us. I had spent months working with the property management company, upgrading amenities and planning renovations to create the perfect family retreat. The guest suites were being redecorated with custom furniture. The spa was getting new treatment rooms. I had even commissioned a private wine cellar stocked with rare vintages that I planned to share with my parents during cozy evening conversations by the fireplace. But if I owned Silverstone, how were my parents accessing the facilities? I grabbed my laptop and pulled up the resort's account management system. As the owner, I had administrative access to all guest records and membership databases. What I found made my stomach lurch with a sickening combination of anger and disbelief. There it was in black and white. A guest reservation under the name Patricia Hamilton, with a note that they were close family friends of the new owner and had been granted temporary access to the Castellano family membership while the transition was being finalized. The Castellanos were the previous owners, and I had agreed to honor their existing memberships for a 6-month grace period as part of the purchase agreement. My parents had somehow discovered my ownership and were masquerading as my representatives to gain access to amenities they could never afford. But it got worse. According to the detailed billing records I was now scrolling through, they hadn't just used basic facilities. Over the past 3 days, they had charged spa treatments, wine tastings, gourmet meals, and activities to the membership account, racking up an additional $12,000 in services. The itemized list read like a fantasy vacation wish list. Deep tissue massages for $150 each. A private sommelier-guided tasting of rare Bordeaux wines at $300 per person. Dinner at the resort's Michelin-starred restaurant, where the tasting menu alone cost $200 before wine pairings. They had even booked helicopter tours of the valley at $800 per flight. All of this was being charged to an account that I was ultimately responsible for as the property owner. They were spending my money while pretending to be my authorized representatives, creating financial obligations I knew nothing about, while simultaneously lying about their need for emergency funds. I called the resort's main number, my hands shaking as I waited for someone to answer. When the concierge picked up, her voice was warm and professional. Silverstone Resort and Spa, this is Jennifer. How may I assist you today? This is Diane Mitchell, the property owner. I need to speak with someone about unauthorized charges on the Castellano membership account. There was a brief pause before Jennifer's tone became more deferential. Of course, Ms. Mitchell. Let me connect you with our guest services manager immediately. Within minutes, I was speaking with David, who confirmed my worst fears. Not only had my parents been charging services to the membership account, but they had been telling staff elaborate stories about their connection to me. According to David, Patricia had presented herself as my personal assistant who was evaluating the property for potential family events. Robert had claimed to be my business consultant who was assessing the resort's suitability for corporate retreats. The lies were so brazen, so calculated that I struggled to process them. These weren't desperate people making poor decisions in a moment of weakness. This was systematic deception, carefully planned and executed with the kind of precision that suggested they had been thinking about this for quite some time. I need copies of all documentation related to their stay, I told David. Every conversation, every authorization, every charge. And I need to know exactly how they obtained access to the membership information in the first place. As David compiled the records, I stared out my apartment window at the San Francisco skyline, watching fog roll in from the bay like a gray shroud. The city that had brought me so much professional success suddenly felt cold and isolating. The money I had earned, the independence I had fought for, the future I had built. None of it mattered if the people I loved most in the world saw me only as a resource to exploit. The next morning brought revelations that shattered any remaining illusions I had about my family's integrity. I called my cousin Marcus, who worked as a loan officer at First National Bank in Sacramento, hoping he might have insights into how my parents had accessed confidential resort information. What he told me made my blood run cold. Deanne, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but your mom came to me about 2 months ago asking questions about your finances. Marcus said, his voice uncomfortable. She wanted to know about any major purchases or investments you might have made. I told her I couldn't discuss your private banking information, but she seemed really determined to find out what you were spending money on. The pieces clicked together with nauseating clarity. During her last visit to my apartment in April, Patricia had insisted on helping me organize my home office while I cooked dinner. She had spent nearly an hour alone in there, claiming she was just tidying up the paperwork on your desk. I'd been touched by her rare gesture of helpfulness, never imagining she was actually photographing confidential documents. I immediately contacted Silverstone's security department and requested access to surveillance footage from the past week. As the property owner, I had the right to review any recordings for security purposes. What I saw on those tapes would haunt me for weeks to come. There was my family strolling through the resort's manicured grounds with the confidence of people who belonged there. Patricia wore a flowing sundress and designer sunglasses, gesturing grandly as she pointed out architectural features to other guests. Robert had donned his best polo shirt and khakis, looking every inch the successful businessman as he chatted with staff members near the golf course. But it was Brianna who truly shocked me. In every frame, she radiated the kind of easy entitlement that comes from a lifetime of privilege. She floated through the scenes like she owned the place, which in a twisted way I suppose she thought she did. And she wasn't alone. Walking beside my sister with his arm casually draped around her waist was a man I had never seen before. Tall, lean, with carefully styled dark hair and an expensive watch that caught the California sunlight. He moved through the resort with the same proprietary confidence as the rest of my family. This had to be the secret boyfriend Patricia had mentioned in passing months ago. The one Brianna was supposedly taking things slow with and didn't want to introduce to the family yet. The timestamp on the footage revealed they had been at the resort for 5 days, not the 3 I had initially calculated from Brianna's social media posts. 5 days of unauthorized luxury, funded by lies and deception, while I sat alone in my apartment, believing I was helping with emergency roof repairs. I watched my family access areas of the resort that were restricted to premium membership holders. They toured the private wine cellar that I had personally curated, selecting bottles that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. They lounged in the VIP cabanas that required special reservations. They even used the owner's private elevator to access the penthouse suite that was meant to be my personal retreat space. The security guard monitoring the cameras, a professional named James who had worked at luxury resorts for over 15 years, walked me through additional footage that revealed the true scope of their deception. "Your family members have been telling other guests some interesting stories," he said, pulling up recordings from the pool area. "According to what we've overheard, they're evaluating the property for your upcoming wedding reception." I nearly choked. I wasn't even dating anyone, let alone planning a wedding. But there on camera was Patricia, gesturing expansively as she spoke with a wealthy-looking couple beside the infinity pool. I couldn't hear the audio, but her animated expressions and the other couple's impressed nods suggested she was weaving quite a tale about my fictional engagement and elaborate wedding plans. "There's more," James continued, switching to footage from the resort's main restaurant. "The young lady has been particularly creative with her storytelling." The camera showed Brianna holding court at a corner table surrounded by other young guests who hung on her every word. She was clearly in her element, playing the role of the sophisticated resort insider with an audience eager to be impressed by her insider knowledge and family connections. But the most damaging footage came from the VIP wine cellar. There was Brianna with her mysterious boyfriend browsing the rare vintage collection like they were shopping at a corner store. The boyfriend appeared to be making notes on his phone as they selected bottles, creating what looked suspiciously like an inventory list. When they left the cellar, they carried a case of wine that included a bottle of 1947 Chateau d'Yquem that I had purchased at auction for $8,000. The theft wasn't just financial, it was personal. Every bottle in that cellar had been carefully chosen, each vintage selected for its significance or rarity. That particular sauterne was meant to be opened on a special family occasion, perhaps my future wedding or the birth of my first child. Now it was probably being consumed by strangers at some impromptu party, its history and value reduced to nothing more than expensive alcohol for people who couldn't appreciate its provenance. As I compiled evidence of my family's unauthorized access and theft, I realized this wasn't just about money or even about the lies they had told. This was about a fundamental betrayal of trust that went to the core of who I thought they were and who I believed myself to be in their lives. I had spent years trying to earn their love and respect, never realizing that they saw me not as a daughter and sister, but as a mark to be exploited. Armed with the security footage and detailed billing records, I decided to dig deeper into the financial trail my family had left behind. What I discovered over the next several hours of investigation made me question everything I thought I knew about their financial situation and my role in enabling their deception. I started by reviewing my own bank records, tracing every transfer I had made to help with their various emergencies over the past year. The pattern that emerged was both systematic and heartbreaking. Every few weeks, like clockwork, one of them would call with a crisis that required immediate financial intervention. The total was staggering $28,300 in less than 8 months. Each request had come with urgent pleas and detailed explanations about why they couldn't possibly handle the expense themselves. Patricia would cry about their fixed income and limited savings. Robert would apologize profusely for having to ask, claiming he had exhausted every other option. Brianna would promise to pay me back as soon as her art career took off. But now seeing them live it up at my resort while charging thousands more in luxury services, I realized that every single emergency had probably been fabricated. There was no broken water heater, no urgent dental work, no suspicious medical tests. They had been systematically lying to me for months, creating fictional crises to fund a lifestyle they couldn't afford while keeping me emotionally manipulated through guilt and obligation. I decided to verify my suspicions by doing some detective work. I called the Sacramento County Tax Assessor's office and discovered that my parents' property taxes had actually decreased this year due to a successful appeal they had filed in January. The emergency payment I had made was completely unnecessary. A quick call to Dr. Richardson, Patricia's longtime physician, revealed that she hadn't had any expensive diagnostic testing done in over 2 years. Her insurance had covered her routine checkups without any unusual copays or out-of-pocket expenses. Robert's transmission repair story fell apart when I remembered that Marcus had mentioned seeing the Buick running perfectly just last week. I drove to Sacramento that afternoon and found it parked in their driveway, purring like a kitten when Robert started it to move it out of my way. But the most devastating discovery came when I checked my phone records. As the account holder for our family plan, another expense I had taken on to help them save money, I had access to detailed text message logs for all the phones on the plan. What I found in those logs made me physically sick. There were dozens of messages between my parents and Brianna dating back months discussing their plans to manage Deanne's contributions to fund various luxuries. They had code names for different types of requests. Roof work meant vacation funds, medical expenses meant spa treatments, car repairs meant restaurant meals and entertainment. The most damaging exchange had taken place just 3 weeks before their current resort trip. Patricia. Roofing estimate came in higher than expected. Need to bump the ask to $3K. Roberts. Think she'll go for it. Last request was only 6 weeks ago. Brianna. Trust me, she'll pay. Deanne always feels guilty about not visiting enough. Play up the emergency angle. Patricia. Perfect. I'll call her after her work meeting when she's stressed. She never questions anything when she's distracted. Reading those messages felt like having my heart surgically removed without anesthesia. They had been playing me like a violin timing their requests for maximum emotional impact and minimum scrutiny. Every tear Patricia had shed during her phone calls, every apology Robert had offered, every promise Brianna had made. All of it was calculated theater designed to separate me from my money. The betrayal went beyond the financial theft, devastating as that was. They had weaponized my love for them, using my desire to be a good daughter and sister as a tool to manipulate and exploit me. Every time I had wired money, I thought I was helping my family through genuine difficulties. Instead, I was funding their deception and enabling them to treat me like a personal banking service, rather than a human being deserving of honesty and respect. But the final straw came in a voicemail I received that evening while I was still processing the evidence I had gathered. It was Patricia calling from the resort, her voice bright and cheerful as she left what she probably thought was a routine manipulation. Hi, sweetheart. Hope you're having a lovely birthday. I know we haven't talked much lately, but we've run into some unexpected expenses here at the resort. The management is requiring additional fees that weren't included in the original package, something about premium service charges. Could you possibly wire another $5,000 to cover these surprise costs? I promise we'll be more careful about reading the fine print next time. Oh, and maybe, if this all works out well, we might be able to include you on the next family trip. Wouldn't that be nice? Call me back when you get this. Love you. The casual cruelty of that message, asking me to fund more of their luxury vacation while dangling the possibility of future inclusion like a carrot on a stick, finally broke through the last of my denial. They had no intention of changing their behavior. This wasn't a temporary lapse in judgment or a moment of weakness. This was who they were, and I was simply a resource to be exploited until I either ran out of money or finally stood up for myself. As I sat in my car outside their house, staring at the perfect lawn and well-maintained exterior that supposedly needed emergency roof repairs, I realized that I had 2 choices. I could continue enabling their deception, writing check after check while they laughed at my gullibility behind my back. Or I could finally take control of the situation and show them that their favorite ATM was officially out of service. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly easy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying decades of memories that now took on completely different meanings. Every family gathering where I had felt like an outsider, every achievement they had dismissed, every time they had made me feel like my success was somehow less valuable than Brianna's artistic pursuits. It all made sense now. I was 8 years old when Brianna was born, old enough to remember the shift in our household dynamics. Before her arrival, I had been the center of my parents' world. Robert would spend hours teaching me chess and helping with my math homework. Patricia would braid my hair each morning and pack special notes in my lunchbox. But when Brianna arrived, their attention pivoted entirely to their beautiful baby daughter with her huge brown eyes and infectious giggle. At first, I told myself it was natural. New babies need lots of care, and I was old enough to be more independent. But as the years passed, the imbalance never corrected itself. Brianna remained their precious princess, while I became the responsible older sister who was expected to help without complaint. When I showed an early aptitude for mathematics and computer programming, my parents seemed almost disappointed. "Don't you want to try dance classes like Brianna?" Patricia would ask. "Or maybe art lessons? You spend too much time alone with those computers." They treated my interests like a phase I would eventually outgrow, something to be tolerated rather than encouraged. High school brought the first major betrayal. I had been selected as valedictorian and was scheduled to give the graduation speech, a moment I had been anticipating for months. But when graduation day arrived, my parents were absent from the auditorium. They were 3 hours away at Brianna's middle school art show, where she had won second place in a regional competition for her watercolor painting of our family dog. "We're so proud of both our girls," Patricia had said when they finally called to congratulate me hours later. "Brianna's painting was absolutely stunning. Mrs. Anderson said she has real talent. Oh, and congratulations on your speech, honey. I'm sure it was lovely." College graduation 4 years later followed the same pattern. While I was earning my computer science degree summa cum laude from Stanford, they were attending Brianna's gallery opening at her community college. "It's her first professional showing," Robert had explained. "She was so nervous about it. You understand, right? You're strong and independent. Brianna needs more support." The pattern continued through my early career successes. When I landed my first job at a prestigious tech startup, they were helping Brianna move into her first apartment. When I got promoted to lead developer, they were funding Brianna's European art tour. When I started my own company, they were planning Brianna's birthday party. I had always told myself that they were proud of me in their own way, that they just expressed love differently. But now I understood the truth. They had been systematically conditioning me to accept less while giving more. My independence and success threatened their ability to control me, so they kept me emotionally hungry, always reaching for validation that never quite came. The most painful memories were the ones where I had actively participated in my own marginalization, like the time I offered to pay for a family vacation to Hawaii so we could all spend time together. "That's so generous, sweetheart," Patricia had said, "but Brianna gets anxious about flying long distances. Maybe just a weekend trip to Lake Tahoe instead." We never took that trip. The money I had set aside somehow got redirected to help with Brianna's credit card debt from her art supply purchases. Or the Christmas, when I had saved up to buy everyone meaningful gifts. A vintage watch for Robert that he had admired in a store window, a jewelry box for Patricia that matched her grandmother's ring, and professional art supplies for Brianna's studio. When I arrived home Christmas morning, I discovered they had decided to spend the holiday at Brianna's boyfriend's family cabin instead. "It was a last-minute invitation," they explained. "We didn't want to impose on you to change your plans. I spent Christmas alone surrounded by wrapped gifts that no one would ever receive." Each memory was a fresh wound, but understanding the pattern gave me something I had never had before: clarity. This wasn't about family dynamics or different personalities or competing priorities. This was about a systematic campaign to keep me isolated and compliant while maximizing the financial benefits I could provide. The text messages I had discovered earlier that day played on repeat in my mind. Deanne always feels guilty about not visiting enough. Play up the emergency angle. They had been studying my emotional responses like scientists conducting an experiment, noting which triggers produced the most generous donations and the least questioning. I thought about all the times I had apologized for being too busy with work to visit more often. All the times I had felt guilty for living in San Francisco while they remained in Sacramento. All the times I had wondered if I was being selfish for pursuing my career instead of staying closer to family. They had encouraged those feelings, nurtured my guilt and self-doubt because it made me easier to manipulate. But what hurt most was realizing how much of my identity had been shaped by their manipulation. I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove I was worthy of their love, working harder and achieving more in hopes of finally earning the recognition I craved. Even my financial success had become another tool they use against me, creating false emergencies to exploit my newfound wealth while simultaneously diminishing my accomplishments. The voicemail Patricia had left earlier that evening played again in my mind. Maybe if this all works out well, we might be able to include you on the next family trip. The casual cruelty of that statement, treating my inclusion in family activities as a reward contingent on my continued financial compliance, crystallized everything that was wrong with our relationship. I wasn't their daughter. I was their personal charity fund valued only for what I could provide rather than who I was as a person. They had turned our family bond into a transactional relationship where my worth was measured solely in dollar signs. As dawn broke over San Francisco Bay, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to wire them another $5,000. I wasn't going to enable their deception for another day. And I certainly wasn't going to continue funding a vacation that excluded me while they lived it up at a resort I actually owned. It was time for my family to learn that their favorite ATM was about to be permanently out of service. But more than that, it was time for me to reclaim my self-respect and show them that actions have consequences, even when those actions are taken against someone who has spent a lifetime trying to earn their love. I picked up my phone and began making the calls that would set everything in motion. Instead of confronting my family immediately, I decided to let them dig their own graves deeper. The security footage and financial records had given me a complete picture of their deception, but I wanted to document everything they did with full knowledge of their crimes. Sometimes the best way to expose a liar is to give them enough rope to hang themselves. I called Jennifer, the resort manager, and requested a private meeting to discuss the situation with my family guests. An hour later, I was sitting in her tastefully appointed office overlooking the vineyard, explaining the complex web of lies that had brought my parents to Silverstone. Jennifer was a consummate professional in her mid-40s who had managed luxury properties throughout California's wine country. She listened to my story with the kind of careful attention that comes from years of dealing with wealthy families and their complicated dynamics. When I finished explaining the situation, her expression was sympathetic but resolute. Ms. Mitchell, I want to assure you that we had no idea about the unauthorized nature of their stay, she said. Your mother presented herself very convincingly as your representative, and she had detailed knowledge about the property that supported her claims. We require identification and verification for membership access, but she provided what appeared to be legitimate authorization. I pulled out copies of the forged documents my parents had used to gain access. They were surprisingly sophisticated. Letterhead that looked official, signatures that resembled my handwriting, and language that sounded appropriately legal. Someone had put considerable effort into creating these fraudulent authorizations. Rather than having them removed immediately, I'd like to continue monitoring their activities. I told Jennifer. Can you accommodate any requests they make while documenting everything for legal purposes? I want a complete record of their unauthorized use of my property and facilities. Jennifer agreed to the plan, though she expressed concern about the potential liability issues. We established protocols for staff to fulfill any requests my family made, maintain detailed records of all charges and activities, and immediately notify me of any concerning behavior. Most importantly, she would personally oversee their interactions with other guests to ensure they didn't create problems that could damage the resort's reputation. There's something else you should know, Jennifer added as our meeting concluded. Your sister has been quite active in the social areas of the resort. Yesterday evening, she hosted what she described as an intimate wine tasting for several other guests in the private cellar. She told them she was curating a special experience as part of her family's ownership benefits. My stomach dropped. Brianna wasn't just stealing wine. She was actively using my property to entertain strangers while pretending to have legitimate access. This wasn't passive fraud anymore. It was an active scheme to leverage my assets for her personal social gain. How many people attended this wine tasting? I asked. 8 guests, plus your sister and her companion. They consumed approximately $2,000 worth of rare vintages from your personal collection, and several attendees expressed interest in booking similar experiences for future visits. $2,000 in wine that I had carefully curated, consumed by strangers who thought they were being treated by the resort owner's generous sister. The violation felt deeply personal, as if Brianna had invited strangers into my home and ransacked my most precious possessions while playing hostess with my belongings. I spent the rest of the afternoon consulting with my attorney, Sarah, about the legal implications of my family's actions. Sarah specialized in white-collar crime and had helped several tech entrepreneurs deal with financial fraud cases. Her assessment was sobering but clear. What your family has done constitutes multiple felonies, she explained, identity theft, fraud, forgery, and potentially embezzlement, if we can prove they obtained the membership information through deliberate deception. The dollar amounts involved push this into serious criminal territory. We discussed the evidence I had gathered and the additional documentation we would need to build an airtight case. Sarah recommended allowing my family to continue their unauthorized stay for a few more days to fully document the scope of their crimes, while simultaneously protecting my interests as a property owner and business operator. The key is establishing intent and pattern of behavior, Sarah said. If this was a one-time mistake or misunderstanding, prosecutors might be lenient. But if we can show systematic deception over time combined with forged documents and stolen property, that's a much more serious matter. That evening, I received another call from Jennifer with disturbing news. During dinner service, Robert had approached the sommelier requesting access to the owner's private reserve for a special celebration. When the sommelier explained that such access required direct authorization from me, Robert claimed there had been a miscommunication and that I was unreachable due to urgent business travel. He was quite insistent, Jennifer reported. He mentioned something about celebrating your recent engagement and wanting to open a bottle of champagne that you had specifically recommended for the occasion. When our sommelier remained polite but firm about needing direct authorization, your father became somewhat agitated. Engagement. There was that fictional wedding story again, now being used to pressure staff into providing access to my most valuable wine collection. Robert was spinning increasingly elaborate lies to maintain their facade, while pressuring employees who were trying to follow proper protocols. But the most concerning development came later that evening. According to the night manager, Brianna had been approaching other guests with business cards identifying herself as an events coordinator for a Silverstone Resort. She was apparently soliciting bookings for future wine tastings and private dinners, collecting deposits from interested parties who believed they were booking legitimate resort experiences. This crossed a line from personal theft into commercial fraud. Brianna wasn't just stealing from me, she was actively running a con game using my property as the backdrop, collecting money from innocent guests who thought they were dealing with a legitimate resort representative. The potential liability issues were staggering, and the damage to Silverstone's reputation could be irreversible if word of this scam spread through the close-knit luxury travel community. I realized that my family's crimes had evolved beyond simple theft into something much more dangerous and sophisticated. They weren't just taking advantage of my generosity anymore. They were actively exploiting my business assets to run their own criminal enterprise. Every day I allowed this to continue, increased the potential damage to my reputation, my property, and innocent third parties who were being defrauded by people claiming to represent my interests. It was time to spring the trap, but I wanted to make sure that when I did, the consequences would be swift, decisive, and impossible to explain away with more lies and manipulation. My family had spent decades treating me like a fool. Now they were about to discover that I was much smarter than they had ever given me credit for, and that their favorite victim was finally ready to fight back. The next morning brought a call from Jennifer that made my blood pressure spike. The situation at Silverstone had deteriorated overnight in ways I never could have anticipated. What started as unauthorized use of resort facilities had mushroomed into a full-scale criminal enterprise run by my own family members. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm afraid we have a serious problem." Jennifer's voice was tight with professional concern. "Your sister and her companion moved into the owner's private suite last night without authorization. They told our night staff that you had personally approved the upgrade due to noise complaints from other guests." The owner's suite was my personal retreat space, a 2,000-square-foot penthouse with panoramic valley views, a private wine cellar, and amenities I had specifically customized for my own use. It wasn't part of the general resort inventory. It was my private residence when I visited the property. The idea of Brianna and her mysterious boyfriend sleeping in my bed and using my personal space felt like the ultimate violation. "That's not all," Jennifer continued. "They hosted a party in the suite last night for approximately 50 people, catering live music, full bar service, the works. They told our events coordinator that it was a celebration for your engagement and that all expenses should be charged to your personal account." 50 people in my private suite, celebrating a fictional engagement while running up charges that would easily reach $20,000 or $30,000. The scope of their deception had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. They weren't just stealing from me anymore, they were using my property as their personal entertainment venue while inviting strangers to party in my most private space. "Who were the guests?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. A mix of other resort guests and what appeared to be local contacts," Jennifer replied. "Your sister introduced her companion as the resort events manager, and he was actively networking with attendees distributing business cards for something called Silverstone exclusive experiences. Several guests expressed interest in booking similar events for future stays." The business cards were the final straw, Tyler. I had finally learned the boyfriend's name from the registration records. Wasn't just along for the ride. He was actively running a side business using my resort as the venue, my reputation as the credibility, and my resources as the product. They had transformed my family retreat into a commercial operation without my knowledge or consent. I immediately accessed the security footage from the previous evening, and what I saw made me physically sick. The feed showed dozens of strangers wandering through my private suite, drinking from my personal wine collection, and treating my carefully designed retreat space like a public party venue. Tyler moved through the crowd like a seasoned host, clearly in his element as he worked the room and collected contact information from potential clients. But Brianna was the most shocking presence in those recordings. Gone was any pretense of being a guest or family member enjoying a vacation. She commanded the space like she owned it, directing catering staff and making announcements to the crowd with the confidence of someone who truly believed she had every right to be there. She had fully embraced the role of resort owner's sister, leveraging my success to create her own social and business opportunities. The audio pickup from the suite security system captured fragments of conversations that revealed the true scope of their operation. Tyler was apparently offering exclusive packages that included private wine tastings, helicopter tours, and access to owner-only amenities, all of which would be booked through his fictitious business and charged to accounts I was ultimately responsible for. One particularly damaging conversation involved a wealthy couple from Los Angeles who were interested in booking their anniversary celebration at Silverstone. Tyler quoted them a price of $15,000 for a weekend package that included services and amenities that didn't even exist. When they offered to pay a deposit immediately, he collected $5,000 in cash, promising to coordinate directly with ownership to ensure their event would be perfect. $5,000 in cash for services that would never be delivered, collected by someone with no authority to represent my business interests. This wasn't family drama anymore. It was organized fraud that could result in criminal charges and civil lawsuits that would destroy everything I had worked to build. I called Sarah immediately, and she agreed to meet me at the resort that afternoon. The legal implications had grown exponentially overnight, and we needed to take immediate action to protect both my personal interests and the resort's business reputation. This has moved way beyond simple family theft, Sarah explained as we reviewed the evidence. Your sister's companion appears to have prior experience with hospitality fraud. The sophistication of the fake business cards, the confident networking approach, the systematic collection of deposits. This looks like someone who has run similar scams before. That afternoon, Sarah ran a background check on Tyler Morrison, the name that appeared on the fake business cards. What we discovered confirmed our worst fears. Tyler had 3 prior arrests for fraud-related crimes, including a conviction for running fake event planning services at luxury hotels in Nevada. He had served 18 months in prison before being released on parole just 6 months ago. My sister wasn't just dating a criminal. She was actively partnering with him to exploit my assets and reputation as part of his ongoing pattern of fraud. Whether Brianna understood the full scope of Tyler's criminal background or was being manipulated herself, she was now an active participant in serious crimes that could result in federal prosecution. The deposit money Tyler had collected from the Los Angeles couple wasn't the only cash changing hands. Security footage from the past 2 days showed him accepting payments from at least 4 other groups of guests, promising exclusive experiences and access that he had no authority to provide. The total amount of fraudulent deposits appeared to exceed $20,000 money that had been collected from innocent people who believed they were dealing with legitimate resort representatives. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Tyler had been photographing other guests' personal information. Security cameras captured him taking pictures of credit cards and identification documents that guests had left unattended in common areas. He was apparently building a database of potential identity theft victims, using my resort as a hunting ground for future criminal activities. The scope of the criminal enterprise my family had created was staggering. What started as unauthorized use of resort facilities had evolved into identity theft fraud, money laundering, and potentially racketeering charges. Every day they remained at Silverstone increased the potential damage to innocent victims and my business reputation. But beyond the legal and financial implications, the personal betrayal cut deeper than any crime against my property. These weren't desperate people making poor choices in a moment of weakness. This was calculated, systematic criminal behavior that exploited my love and trust while putting innocent third parties at risk of financial harm. As I sat in my car outside Silverstone that evening, watching the lights twinkle in the valley below, I realized that my family had crossed a line from which there could be no return. They weren't victims of circumstance or temporary lapses in judgment. They were criminals who had chosen to make me their primary target while using my success as a platform for hurting other people. Tomorrow would be the day of reckoning. But first, I needed to make sure that every aspect of their crimes was fully documented and that innocent guests who had been defrauded would receive justice along with my own vindication. The next morning, Sarah and I met at her downtown Sacramento office to finalize our strategy. Her corner suite overlooked the state capitol building, a fitting backdrop for what felt like the most important legal consultation of my life. The evidence we had compiled painted a picture of systematic fraud that went far beyond family dysfunction into serious criminal territory. "Let me be absolutely clear about what your family has done," Sarah said, spreading documents across her mahogany conference table. "This isn't civil theft or breach of trust. These are multiple felonies that could result in federal prosecution and significant prison time." She walked me through each crime methodically. Identity theft for using my name and reputation without authorization, fraud for obtaining services under false pretenses, forgery for creating false documents to gain access to the resort, money laundering for collecting deposits from guests under fraudulent circumstances, and potentially RICO violations if we could establish that Tyler's involvement represented an ongoing criminal enterprise. "The dollar amounts push this into serious federal territory," Sarah explained. "When fraud exceeds $10,000 and crosses state lines, which it did when they solicited deposits from guests from other states, it becomes a federal crime with mandatory minimum sentences." But the legal implications were just one aspect of the disaster my family had created. Sarah had spent the morning on calls with other attorneys who specialize in hospitality law, and their assessment of the potential civil liability was sobering. "Every guest who paid Tyler deposits for services he couldn't provide has grounds for a lawsuit against you as a property owner," she explained. "Even though you had no knowledge of his activities, the courts often hold property owners responsible for fraud committed on their premises by people claiming to represent their interests. The potential damages could reach into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, not including the cost of defending multiple lawsuits and the irreparable damage to Silverstone's reputation in the luxury travel industry." Word of fraud and criminal activity spreads quickly in the close-knit community of high-end resort destinations, and guests who felt victimized would likely share their experiences on social media and travel review sites. "There's also the matter of Tyler's criminal background," Sarah continued. "I've been in contact with his parole officer in Nevada. Using stolen identity information and collecting money under false pretenses are clear violations of his parole terms. He'll likely be arrested immediately when we file charges, and his prior convictions mean he's looking at a much longer sentence this time." The revelation about Tyler's parole status added another layer of complexity to the situation. Brianna wasn't just dating a criminal. She was harboring a fugitive who was actively violating the terms of his supervised release. Whether she knew about his background or not, she could face additional charges for aiding and abetting a known offender. "What about my parents?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "Robert and Patricia face the most serious charges," Sarah replied. "The forged documents, the systematic deception, the months of financial manipulation. Prosecutors love cases with clear paper trails and obvious intent to defraud. They're looking at 3 to 5 years minimum, possibly more if we can establish a pattern of ongoing financial crimes." The thought of my parents in prison was devastating despite everything they had done. These were the people who had raised me, who had taught me right from wrong, who had shaped my understanding of family and loyalty. The fact that they had chosen to betray those very values in pursuit of money and luxury felt like watching my entire childhood collapse into lies and deception. But Sarah wasn't finished with her legal assessment. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," she said, pulling out a thick folder of financial documents. "I've been reviewing your family's finances for the past several years, and there are some concerning patterns that suggest this fraud goes much deeper than the resort incident." What she showed me next shattered the last of my illusions about my family's integrity. Over the past 3 years, my parents had been systematically collecting money from various sources while maintaining their facade of financial struggle. Social Security benefits they weren't entitled to by claiming Patricia was disabled when she wasn't. Medicare fraud by billing for medical services they never received. Even charity fraud by accepting donations from their church congregation for financial hardships that didn't exist. The resort incident was just the tip of the iceberg, Sarah explained. Your parents appear to have been running multiple financial scams for years, using their reputation as struggling retirees to collect money from anyone willing to help. Your contributions were just the largest and most reliable source of funds. The total amount of fraudulent income they had generated over 3 years approached $200,000. Money stolen from government programs, religious organizations, charitable individuals, and ultimately me. They weren't victims of circumstances or people who had made poor choices. They were career criminals who had built their entire lifestyle around deception and theft. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, outlining our plan of action. "Tomorrow morning, we'll coordinate with local police and FBI Financial Crimes Division to execute arrests while your family is still at the resort. We'll have search warrants for their Sacramento home and vehicles to recover evidence and stolen property. And we'll immediately freeze any accounts where they might have hidden fraudulent proceeds." The speed and scope of law enforcement response would send a clear message that financial crimes have serious consequences regardless of family relationships or emotional manipulation. But Sarah also wanted to ensure that innocent victims received justice and restitution as quickly as possible. "We'll work with the district attorney's office to establish a victim restitution fund," she explained. "Every guest who paid deposits to Tyler will receive full refunds plus damages for their inconvenience and emotional distress. The resort's insurance should cover most of these costs, but you may be personally responsible for some amounts, depending on how the civil litigation develops." As our meeting concluded, Sarah handed me a document that would change my relationship with my family forever, a comprehensive restraining order that would prohibit them from contacting me, approaching my property, or using my name or likeness for any purpose. It was legal protection against future manipulation and fraud, but it was also a formal declaration that our family relationship was over. "I know this is incredibly difficult," Sarah said as I stared at the restraining order, "but you need to understand that continuing to enable their behavior doesn't just hurt you. It hurts every future victim they might target. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold people accountable for their actions." That evening, I sat in my apartment looking out at the San Francisco skyline, trying to process the magnitude of what tomorrow would bring. In less than 12 hours, police would arrest my parents and sister for crimes that could send them to prison for years. The family that had shaped my entire understanding of love and loyalty would be exposed as criminals who had spent years systematically stealing from anyone who showed them kindness. But for the first time in my adult life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, the freedom that comes from refusing to be a victim anymore. Tomorrow would bring justice, but it would also bring closure and the opportunity to build relationships based on honesty and mutual respect rather than manipulation and financial exploitation. The final phase of our plan required precise coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, resort security, and legal representatives. Sarah had spent the evening working with FBI financial crime specialists and local police to ensure that when we moved against my family, the arrests would be swift, comprehensive, and impossible to challenge on procedural grounds. We met at 6 in the morning at a coffee shop near Silverstone to review the final details. Present were Sarah FBI Special Agent Monica Rodriguez, who specialized in white-collar crime, Sergeant Williams from the Napa County Sheriff's Department, and David Chen, a financial crimes investigator who would handle asset recovery and victim restitution. The key is timing everything perfectly, Agent Rodriguez explained as she reviewed arrest warrants that had been signed by a federal judge just hours earlier. We want to take them into custody when they're all together before they have a chance to destroy evidence or contact potential accomplices. According to Jennifer's intelligence from resort staff, my family had planned another elaborate event for that afternoon, a wine country investment seminar that Tyler was hosting for wealthy guests interested in exclusive resort partnership opportunities. It was the perfect setup for catching them in the act of actively defrauding innocent victims while using my property as their base of operations. But there was an additional element to our plan that would make their exposure even more dramatic and undeniable. Sarah had arranged for the legitimate Castellano family, the previous resort owners whose membership my parents had stolen, to arrive unexpectedly during the seminar. When the real membership holders confronted the imposters, there would be no way for my parents to explain their unauthorized presence or continued lies about their relationship to me. Mrs. Castellano is particularly eager to participate, Jennifer reported. She's been receiving bills for charges she never authorized, and she's quite upset about having her family's reputation associated with fraudulent activities. The Castellanos were a prominent Napa Valley family with deep roots in the wine industry. Having their name connected to criminal fraud could damage business relationships they had built over generations. Their willingness to participate in exposing my family's crimes added legitimate victims beyond just myself and the guests who had been defrauded by Tyler's fake investment schemes. Agent Rodriguez also briefed us on additional evidence that had emerged during their investigation. Tyler's parole officer in Nevada had provided records showing that he had been running similar resort scams across multiple states, always targeting family-owned properties, where he could exploit existing relationships for credibility. My family wasn't his first victims. They were his willing accomplices in a scheme he had perfected through years of criminal experience. We've identified at least 6 other properties where Tyler ran similar operations, Agent Rodriguez explained. He would identify wealthy property owners, research their family relationships, and then approach family members with promises of easy money if they helped him gain access to luxury amenities. Your sister appears to be his most successful partner to date. The revelation that Brianna had been actively recruited for this scheme rather than stumbling into it accidentally changed everything. She wasn't just a family member who had made poor choices. She was a knowing participant in an organized criminal enterprise that had targeted multiple innocent victims across several states. But the most damaging evidence came from financial records that Agent Rodriguez had obtained through federal warrants. Over the past 6 months, Tyler and Brianna had been systematically transferring money from their fraudulent activities to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The total amount exceeded $150,000 money stolen from resort guests, fraudulent investment schemes, and my own accounts through the various emergency requests. This level of financial sophistication suggests long-term planning and intent, Agent Rodriguez said. They weren't just stealing impulsively, they were building a systematic operation designed to maximize profits while minimizing detection. The offshore accounts show they were planning to disappear once they had collected enough money. The thought that my sister had been planning to flee the country, with her criminal boyfriend leaving behind years of fraud and theft while building a new life with stolen money, felt like the ultimate betrayal. Everything about our relationship had been a lie designed to position me as an unwitting funding source for criminal activities that extended far beyond my family. As we finalized the arrest plan, Jennifer provided one more crucial piece of information. Your parents have been telling other guests that they're evaluating Silverstone for a potential sale, she said. They've suggested that the property might be available for purchase by private investors, and several wealthy families have expressed serious interest in making offers. The fake sales scheme represented the pinnacle of their criminal audacity. They were now actively trying to sell property they didn't own to innocent buyers who believed they were dealing with legitimate representatives. The potential damages from this fraud could reach millions of dollars if wealthy families made deposits or signed purchase agreements based on my parents' lies. "That's actually perfect for our purposes," Sergeant Williams noted. "If they're actively running a real estate fraud during this afternoon seminar, we can catch them in the act with multiple witnesses and undeniable evidence. No lawyer in the world would be able to explain away video footage of them accepting deposits for property they don't own." As we prepared to leave for Silverstone, Sarah handed me a final document that represented the legal end of my family relationships. It was a comprehensive lawsuit seeking full restitution for all fraudulent charges, stolen property, and damages to my business reputation, plus punitive damages for the emotional distress caused by years of systematic deception. Filing this lawsuit serves several purposes, Sarah explained. It protects your financial interests, establishes a legal record of their crimes, and makes it clear to any future victims that you were not a willing participant in their fraud. Most importantly, it sends a message that financial crimes within families have the same consequences as crimes against strangers. The afternoon sun was already high as we drove toward Silverstone for what would be the final confrontation with the people who had spent my entire life teaching me that family loyalty meant accepting abuse while providing financial support. In just a few hours, they would learn that their favorite victim had finally decided to fight back, and that the consequences of their crimes would extend far beyond anything they had ever imagined. But as difficult as the coming confrontation would be, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The peace that comes from knowing you're finally standing up for yourself and protecting innocent people from predators who exploit trust and love for personal gain. I arrived at Silverstone just as my family was setting up their fraudulent investment seminar by the infinity pool. From my vantage point in Jennifer's office, I could see them transforming the elegant outdoor space into what looked like a legitimate business presentation. Tyler had arranged professional-looking display boards with fake financial projections, while Brianna distributed glossy brochures that featured photos of my resort alongside fabricated investment opportunities. My parents played their roles perfectly. Patricia wore an expensive navy blazer that I recognized from our last shopping trip together when I had bought it for her as a birthday gift. She moved through the gathering crowd with practiced grace, introducing herself as my family business manager to guests who had been lured by promises of exclusive real estate opportunities. Robert stood beside a rented podium, shuffling through notes for what appeared to be a prepared presentation about resort ownership benefits. There are approximately 30 potential investors present. Agent Rodriguez reported through her earpiece as she observed from the resort's main building. Multiple out-of-state attendees, several with significant net worth based on their vehicle registrations and guest profiles. If your family accepts deposits today, we're looking at federal wire fraud charges in addition to everything else. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Just as Tyler began his opening remarks about rare investment opportunities with his Silverstone ownership group, a black sedan pulled into the resort's circular driveway. Eleanor and Vincent Castellano stepped out, their expressions confused and increasingly angry as they recognized the unauthorized gathering taking place around their former family retreat. Mrs. Castellano, an elegant woman in her 70s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to respect, walked directly toward the pool area where my parents were holding court. Her husband followed, carrying a leather folder that I knew contained documentation of all the fraudulent charges that had been run up on their membership account. "Excuse me." Mrs. Castellano's voice carried clearly across the poolside area, causing conversations to halt and all eyes to turn toward her. "I'm Eleanor Castellano, and this is my husband, Vincent. We're the actual holders of the membership being used for this gathering, and we have no idea who you people are." The color drained from Patricia's face as she realized their deception was about to be exposed in front of dozens of potential victims. But instead of admitting the truth, she doubled down on her lies with a performance that would have been impressive if it weren't so morally reprehensible. "Mrs. Castellano, what a lovely surprise," Patricia said, moving toward her with arms outstretched as if greeting an old friend. "We're Deanne Mitchell's family representatives. I believe there may be some confusion about the membership transfer arrangements during the property acquisition." Mrs. Castellano stepped back, her expression shifting from confusion to outright hostility. "I have no idea who Deanne Mitchell is, and there certainly hasn't been any property acquisition. This resort still operates under agreements we established with the previous management company, who authorized you to use our membership benefits for this commercial event." The crowd of potential investors began murmuring among themselves, sensing that something was seriously wrong with the situation they had been drawn into. Several people pulled out their phones, either to document the confrontation or to verify the claims they had been hearing about investment opportunities. Tyler attempted to salvage the situation with the kind of smooth talking that had probably worked in his previous scams. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this confusion. There appear to be some administrative issues with membership records that will resolve immediately. Perhaps we could move today's presentation to the conference center while we sort out these details." But Vincent Castellano wasn't having any of it. "There are no administrative issues, young man. These people are using our family's membership without authorization, and they've been charging thousands of dollars in services to accounts they have no right to access. I've already contacted local authorities about what appears to be systematic fraud." As if summoned by his words, Sergeant Williams and two uniformed officers appeared at the pool area's entrance. They moved with the purposeful stride of law enforcement officers executing planned arrests, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere from confused confrontation to serious legal crisis. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Sergeant Williams with the Napa County Sheriff's Department." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to controlling chaotic situations. "We need everyone to remain calm while we sort out some legal issues. If you're a guest who paid money for today's presentation, please remain available as we'll need to speak with each of you individually." The reaction was immediate and devastating for my family's carefully constructed facade. Several guests began demanding explanations about the legitimacy of the investment opportunities they had been promised. Others started taking photos and videos of the police presence, undoubtedly planning to share their experiences on social media. The exclusive, sophisticated atmosphere Tyler had created dissolved into chaos and recrimination. But Patricia wasn't finished fighting. Even with police officers approaching and her lies exposed in front of dozens of witnesses, she made one last desperate attempt to manipulate the situation by playing the victim card that had worked so effectively for years. "Officers, thank goodness you're here," she said, moving toward Sergeant Williams with tears streaming down her face. "We've been the victims of a terrible misunderstanding. My daughter owns this property, and we've been trying to help her manage some business difficulties. These people," she gestured toward the Castellanos, "are trying to claim ownership of facilities that belong to my family." The audacity of her lies, even in the face of overwhelming evidence and police intervention, represented everything that was wrong with the people who had raised me. They had spent so many years manipulating situations through emotional manipulation and false victimization that they couldn't conceive of a scenario where their tactics wouldn't work. But this time, they had finally encountered people who were prepared for their deception. Agent Rodriguez stepped forward, displaying federal credentials that immediately elevated the seriousness of the situation beyond anything my parents had anticipated. "Mrs. Hamilton, I'm Special Agent Rodriguez with the FBI Financial Crimes Division. You, your husband, and your daughter are under arrest for multiple federal crimes, including fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right." The moment when realization finally dawned on Patricia's face was something I will remember for the rest of my life. The confident manipulator who had spent years controlling situations through lies and emotional blackmail suddenly understood that she had finally encountered consequences that couldn't be talked away or explained with more deception. As Agent Rodriguez began reading them their rights, Robert made one final desperate play by producing the forged documents that supposedly authorized their presence at Silverstone. "We have written permission from the property owner," he said, holding up papers that Tyler had obviously prepared. "Everything we've done has been completely legitimate and properly documented." Sergeant Williams examined the documents for approximately 10 seconds before handing them to Agent Rodriguez. "Sir, these appear to be forgeries with multiple indicators of fraudulent creation. Document forgery is a felony that carries additional penalties beyond the fraud charges you're already facing." The crowd of potential investors watched in fascination and horror as the people who had been promising them exclusive investment opportunities were handcuffed and read their Miranda rights. Several guests were already on their phones, presumably calling lawyers or financial advisors to report their involvement in what was clearly an elaborate fraud scheme. But the most dramatic moment came when Tyler, realizing that his criminal enterprise was collapsing, made a desperate attempt to flee the scene. He pushed through the crowd toward the parking area, apparently hoping to reach his rental car before police could detain him. What he didn't know was that Agent Rodriguez had stationed officers at all resort exits, specifically to prevent such an escape attempt. He made it approximately 50 yards before being tackled by two officers near the valet stand, his arrest witnessed by resort guests, staff members, and anyone else in the vicinity. The sophisticated criminal who had recruited my sister for his fraud schemes was reduced to a common fugitive being handcuffed on the ground while tourists took pictures. As my family was led away in handcuffs, I finally stepped out of the resort's main building to observe the conclusion of their criminal careers. For the first time in decades, I felt no urge to rescue them, no guilt about their consequences, no responsibility for their choices. They had created this situation through years of systematic deception and theft, and they would face the results without any assistance from their favorite victim. The reckoning had finally begun, but justice was only the first step in rebuilding my life, free from the people who had spent 32 years teaching me that love was something you had to purchase with money and silence. The resort's main terrace had transformed into something resembling a crime scene investigation, with FBI agents interviewing potential fraud victims, while resort staff worked to contain the damage to Silverstone's reputation. I stood near the main building's entrance, watching my family's criminal empire collapse in real time as their lies were systematically exposed to everyone they had attempted to defraud. Jennifer approached me with a tablet containing the complete financial records of my family's unauthorized charges. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to see the full scope of what they've done to your property and reputation," she said, her voice mixing professional concern with personal sympathy. "Beyond the obvious theft, they've created obligations and promises that could take months to untangle." The numbers were staggering. Over the past week, they had charged $47,000 in services to accounts I was legally responsible for as the property owner. Spa treatments, private dining experiences, helicopter tours, wine tastings, event planning services. They had lived like royalty while creating financial obligations that threatened the resort's relationships with vendors and service providers. But the monetary theft was only part of the damage. Tyler had been systematically collecting contact information from wealthy guests, promising them access to investment opportunities that didn't exist while building a database for future fraud schemes. The guest list from their fake investment seminar read like a who's who of California's business elite people whose involvement in this fraud could generate negative publicity that would devastate Silverstone's reputation. We've already received 3 calls from major travel publications, Jennifer reported. Word is spreading through social media about the arrests, and we're going to need a comprehensive public relations strategy to protect the resort's standing in the luxury travel industry. Agent Rodriguez joined our conversation with an update on the evidence they had collected during the arrests. Your family had prepared for today's fraud much more extensively than we initially realized, she said, showing me photos from Tyler's rental car. Fake contracts for property sales, forged bank statements, even counterfeit business licenses for their investment company. This wasn't impulsive crime. This was a sophisticated operation designed to steal millions of dollars from innocent victims. The fake contracts were particularly damaging because they purported to offer ownership shares in Silverstone to investors willing to make substantial upfront payments. According to the documents Tyler had prepared, investors could purchase 25% stakes in the resort for payments ranging from $500,000 to $2 million, depending on the level of access and amenities they desired. If they had successfully executed today's scheme, the potential damages could have reached tens of millions of dollars, Agent Rodriguez explained. Several attendees were prepared to write checks for initial investments, and your parents were positioning themselves to collect deposits while promising property transfers they had no authority to make. But the most shocking evidence came from Brianna's personal belongings, which revealed the true extent of her involvement in Tyler's criminal enterprise. Her purse contained detailed notes about guest profiles, including net worth estimates, family information, and psychological assessments about which potential victims would be most susceptible to investment fraud. She had been studying resort guests like a predator, evaluating prey, noting which families had recently experienced windfalls, which individuals seemed eager to impress their social circles, and which couples appeared to make financial decisions based on emotion rather than careful analysis. The clinical nature of her victim profiles demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that went far beyond opportunistic theft. Your sister wasn't just dating a criminal, Agent Rodriguez said, showing me copies of Brianna's handwritten notes. She was actively participating in the psychological manipulation of innocent people. These victim profiles would have made their fraud much more effective by allowing them to tailor their approaches to individual vulnerabilities. Among the most disturbing discoveries were audio recordings Tyler had made of conversations with potential victims, apparently to study their speech patterns and concerns for future manipulation. He had recorded elderly guests discussing their retirement finances, young families talking about college savings plans, and successful entrepreneurs explaining their investment strategies. The recordings revealed that my family had been treating Silverstone not just as a luxury vacation destination, but as a hunting ground for identifying and grooming victims for long-term financial fraud. They had violated the privacy and trust of innocent guests while gathering information that could be used to target them with future scams. But perhaps the most painful evidence was a series of text messages between Brianna and Tyler discussing their plans for my money and property. The messages revealed that they had been planning to maintain their fraud for several more months, while building offshore accounts, then disappear to a country without extradition treaties to enjoy their stolen wealth. Tyler was teaching Brianna how to manipulate you more effectively, Agent Rodriguez explained, showing me message threads that made me sick to read. They had developed specific techniques for timing their requests when you would be most emotionally vulnerable, and they were planning to escalate their demands significantly once they had established their criminal operation. The messages included discussions about faking medical emergencies to generate larger donations, creating false business opportunities that would require my investment, and even suggestions about ways to gain access to my personal bank accounts and financial assets. They had been treating our family relationship as a long-term criminal conspiracy with me as the unwitting target. As Agent Rodriguez continued briefing me on the evidence, a commotion near the resort's entrance drew our attention. News vans from several Bay Area television stations had arrived, their crews setting up cameras and interviewing guests who had witnessed the arrests. The story was already spreading beyond the immediate victims to become a public scandal that would follow my family for years. Ms. Mitchell, a reporter called out when she spotted me near the main building. Can you comment on the arrest of your family members for fraud at your resort? The question hung in the air like a challenge. For 32 years, I had protected my family's reputation while they systematically destroyed my financial security and emotional well-being. I had made excuses for their behavior, covered their mistakes, and absorbed their abuse while maintaining the fiction that we were a loving family with normal problems. But standing there, watching the evidence of their crimes being loaded into police vehicles, while reporters documented their spectacular downfall, I realized that protecting them was no longer my responsibility. They had made their choices, and now the world would learn the truth about who they really were and what they had done to the people who trusted them. My family committed serious crimes against me, my business, and innocent guests at this resort. I said, my voice steady and clear as cameras recorded my words. I had no knowledge of their criminal activities, and I'm grateful to law enforcement for stopping their fraud before more people could be victimized. I will cooperate fully with prosecutors to ensure they face appropriate consequences for their actions. The statement felt like the first honest words I had spoken about my family in decades. No more excuses, no more protection, no more enabling their destructive behavior by pretending it was somehow normal or acceptable. They were criminals who had chosen to target the people who loved them most, and the world deserved to know the truth about their character and choices. As the news crews packed up their equipment and the last of the potential fraud victims finished giving their statements to investigators, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood, complete freedom from the obligation to manage other people's emotions and consequences. My family's reckoning was complete, but my real life was just beginning. The Napa County Courthouse buzzed with activity as my family faced their first arraignment hearing 3 days after their arrests. I sat in the gallery beside Sarah, watching the people who had raised me appear before a federal judge in orange jumpsuits, their hands cuffed and their faces bearing expressions of shock and disbelief that their crimes had finally caught up with them. Judge Patricia Williams, a no-nonsense federal magistrate with 30 years of experience in white-collar crime cases, reviewed the charges with the methodical precision of someone who had seen every possible variation of financial fraud. The litany of accusations against my family read like a criminal law: textbook wire fraud, mail fraud identity, theft, money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. The government alleges that the defendants engaged in a systematic scheme to defraud multiple victims over a period of several years. Judge Williams said, reading from the federal prosecutor's filing, the total monetary damages exceed $300,000, with additional victims still being identified as the investigation continues. $300,000. The number hit me like a physical blow, representing not just the money they had stolen from me, but the systematic theft from government programs, charitable organizations, and innocent individuals who had trusted them. They had built their entire lifestyle around deception, treating fraud as their primary source of income while maintaining the facade of struggling retirees. Tyler faced the most serious charges due to his criminal history and role as the operation's mastermind. Federal prosecutor Amanda Chen outlined evidence showing that he had recruited Brianna specifically for her access to my wealth and property, using their romantic relationship as a cover for criminal conspiracies that spanned multiple states. Mr. Morrison represents a clear danger to the community, Prosecutor Chen argued during the bail hearing. He has used romantic relationships to gain access to victims' assets in at least 4 previous cases, and his sophisticated knowledge of financial fraud makes him a serious flight risk if released pending trial. Judge Williams agreed, denying bail and ordering Tyler held at the federal detention center pending trial. His previous convictions, combined with the offshore accounts and evidence of planning to flee the country, made him too dangerous to release under any circumstances. As he was led away in shackles, Tyler finally showed emotion, his confident criminal facade cracking to reveal the desperation of someone facing decades in federal prison. Brianna's hearing was more complex because her attorney argued that she had been manipulated by Tyler rather than acting as a willing criminal conspirator. The public defender painted her as a naive young woman who had been groomed by an experienced criminal, emphasizing her lack of prior arrests and Tyler's history of targeting family members of wealthy victims. But Prosecutor Chen presented evidence that contradicted the manipulation narrative. Brianna's detailed victim profiles, her active participation in collecting fraudulent deposits, and recorded conversations where she discussed criminal strategies with Tyler demonstrated knowing participation in serious crimes rather than reluctant compliance with an abusive partner. The defendant wasn't a victim of Mr. Morrison's manipulation, Prosecutor Chen told the court. She was his willing partner and an active participant in targeting her own family members and innocent resort guests. Her psychological profiles of potential fraud victims show the calculating mindset of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. Judge Williams set Brianna's bail at $200,000, acknowledging the manipulation arguments while recognizing the evidence of willing criminal participation. My parents would be responsible for posting bond if they wanted her released pending trial, but their own legal troubles made that prospect unlikely. Robert and Patricia faced charges that could result in 15 to 20 years in federal prison due to the systematic nature of their fraud and the multiple victim categories involved. Their defense attorney, a court-appointed public defender named Michael Torres, attempted to argue that their crimes were motivated by financial desperation rather than criminal intent. My clients are retired seniors on fixed incomes who made poor decisions during a period of financial stress. Torres argued, they never intended to hurt anyone, and they deeply regret the choices that brought them before this court today. But the prosecution's evidence painted a very different picture. Financial records showed that Robert and Patricia had been systematically collecting fraudulent income from multiple sources while maintaining substantial savings accounts and investment portfolios. They weren't desperate retirees making survival choices. They were professional criminals who had built comfortable lifestyles through systematic theft. The defendant's bank records show over $180,000 in savings and investments. Prosecutor Chen told the court, they own their home, outright have minimal monthly expenses, and receive adequate income from legitimate retirement benefits. Their crimes were motivated by greed rather than necessity. Judge Williams set their bail at $100,000 each, but with conditions that effectively kept them under house arrest pending trial. They would be required to wear electronic monitoring devices, surrender their passports, and have no contact with victims or potential witnesses, including me. The no contact provision was particularly significant because it legally formalized what had already become an emotional reality. I would never again receive manipulative phone calls requesting emergency funds, never again endure guilt trips about not visiting enough, never again question whether their latest crisis was real or fabricated. The court had officially severed the toxic relationship that had defined my adult life. But the legal proceedings were only the beginning of my family's consequences. The media attention from their arrests had spread beyond local news to national coverage, with several major newspapers and television networks reporting on the tech heiress family fraud story. Their mugshots appeared on websites and social media platforms, permanently documenting their criminal behavior for anyone who might encounter them in the future. The publicity had immediate practical effects on their daily lives. Robert lost his part-time consulting position when his employer learned about the federal charges. Patricia was asked to resign from her volunteer positions at the local hospital and church when their organizations decided that association with accused criminals would damage their reputations. Even Brianna faced consequences with the art gallery where she worked, terminating her employment and canceling her upcoming show. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was the complete collapse of their social relationships. Friends and neighbors who had known them for decades began questioning every interaction, every request for help, every story about financial difficulties. People who had donated money or provided assistance started demanding explanations, and in several cases restitution for funds they now realized had been obtained through deception. The Sacramento Bee published a detailed investigation into their fraud schemes, including interviews with victims who had been targeted over the years. Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor, revealed that she had lent them $8,000 for emergency medical expenses that apparently never existed. Their church had collected special offerings totaling $12,000 to help with supposed financial hardships while they were secretly maintaining comfortable bank balances. Each revelation created new victims and new demands for accountability. The federal prosecutor's office established a victim restitution hotline that received dozens of calls from people who now questioned whether they had been defrauded by the people they had trusted as friends and neighbors. As I left the courthouse that day, reporters asked for my reaction to seeing my family face federal charges. "I'm grateful that justice is being served," I said, meaning every word. "Their victims deserve accountability, and I hope their prosecution prevents them from hurting other people in the future." The statement felt like the final step in reclaiming my identity from people who had spent decades defining me as their personal funding source. I was no longer the daughter who absorbed their abuse while providing financial support, no longer the sister who excused criminal behavior as family loyalty, no longer the victim who enabled their crimes through misplaced love and guilt. I was simply Deanne Mitchell, successful entrepreneur and crime victim, ready to rebuild my life, free from the people who had taught me that family meant accepting manipulation while providing resources for others to exploit. 6 weeks after my family's arrests, I found myself sitting in Dr. Amanda Torres's office, struggling to process the psychological aftermath of discovering that my entire family relationship had been built on systematic deception and financial exploitation. Dr. Torres specialized in helping victims of family financial abuse, a form of trauma that was more common than most people realized, but rarely discussed openly. What you're experiencing is completely normal for someone who has survived years of financial and emotional abuse, Dr. Torres explained during our first session. Family financial abuse is particularly damaging because it combines theft with the violation of trust and love that should define family relationships. The therapy sessions helped me understand patterns I had never recognized while living within them. My parents had used sophisticated psychological techniques to keep me compliant and generous, including strategic timing of their requests, emotional manipulation, through guilt and obligation and intermittent reinforcement that kept me hoping for genuine love and acceptance that never came. They trained you to associate your worth with your ability to solve their problems, Dr. Torres said. Every time you provided money for an emergency, they reinforced the idea that your value to the family was financial rather than personal. Over time, you internalized the belief that love had to be purchased rather than freely given. The revelation that my success had actually threatened their control helped explain decades of dismissive comments about my achievements. Every promotion, every business success, every sign of my independence represented a potential challenge to their ability to manipulate me through financial need. By consistently minimizing my accomplishments while creating artificial crises, they had maintained psychological dominance despite my obvious professional competence. But understanding their tactics didn't immediately heal the damage they had caused. I struggled with waves of anger at their betrayal grief for the family relationships I had thought we shared, and shame about how thoroughly they had deceived me despite my intelligence and business acumen. The woman who had built a successful tech company from nothing had been completely blind to the criminal conspiracy operating within her own family. Dr. Torres helped me recognize that my blindness wasn't a personal failing, but a natural result of the psychological conditioning I had experienced since childhood. Children learn to trust their families for survival, she explained. When that trust is systematically exploited, it creates cognitive dissonance that makes victims dismiss evidence of abuse rather than accept that the people they love are harming them. The therapy process was complicated by ongoing developments in the criminal cases against my family. Tyler had accepted a plea agreement that would result in a 12-year federal prison sentence in exchange for his cooperation in identifying other victims and recovering stolen assets. His testimony revealed that my family had been just one operation in a larger network of financial fraud schemes targeting wealthy families throughout California and Nevada. Brianna's case was more complex because her attorney continued arguing that she had been manipulated by Tyler rather than acting as a willing criminal participant. But additional evidence emerged showing that she had been researching similar fraud schemes online for months before Tyler's arrival, suggesting that she had been actively seeking opportunities to exploit my wealth rather than being reluctantly drawn into his crimes. The most difficult aspect of the ongoing legal proceedings was learning new details about the depth of their deception. Financial investigators discovered that my parents had been claiming me as a dependent on their tax returns while simultaneously reporting me as financially supporting them, creating fraudulent deductions that had reduced their tax obligations for years. They had also been collecting social services benefits by claiming poverty while maintaining undisclosed bank accounts funded by their various fraud schemes. Every new revelation felt like another betrayal, another layer of lies that had shaped relationships I thought were genuine. But Dr. Torres helped me understand that my anger and grief were healthy responses to genuine trauma rather than signs of weakness or failure. "You're mourning the loss of people who never really existed," she explained. "The parents and sister you thought you had were personas they created to exploit your love and generosity. Your grief is real because your love was real, even though their responses to it were fraudulent." The healing process was complicated by well-meaning friends and colleagues who suggested that I should consider forgiveness and reconciliation once my family had served their sentences. The idea that family bonds should transcend criminal behavior was deeply ingrained in American culture, making it difficult for people to understand why I had no intention of rebuilding relationships with people who had spent decades stealing from me. Forgiveness doesn't require ongoing relationship, Dr. Torres reminded me during moments when I questioned my decision to maintain the no-contact orders. You can release anger and resentment without exposing yourself to future abuse. Protecting yourself from people who have demonstrated willingness to harm you isn't revenge. It's self-preservation. But the therapy process also revealed positive changes that had begun since my family's arrests. Without the constant drain of manufactured emergencies and emotional manipulation, I had more mental and emotional energy available for personal relationships and professional projects. I was sleeping better, experiencing less anxiety, and feeling more confident in my judgment about people and situations. Most surprisingly, I was beginning to experience genuine happiness for the first time in years, without the underlying stress of wondering when my family would create their next crisis or make their next demand. I could focus on building the life I wanted rather than constantly managing the consequences of other people's poor choices. The financial recovery process was also progressing better than expected. Federal asset forfeiture procedures had identified and frozen most of the money my family had stolen, including the offshore accounts Tyler had established. Victim restitution funds were being distributed to everyone they had defrauded, and insurance policies were covering most of the damages to Silverstone's reputation and operations. But the most meaningful development was a letter I received from Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who had lent my parents money for fake medical expenses. Instead of anger or demands for restitution, she expressed sympathy for what I had endured and admiration for my courage in holding my family accountable for their crimes. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years," she wrote, "and I've seen too many families destroyed by people who take advantage of love and trust. Thank you for being brave enough to stop them before they could hurt more innocent people. Your parents raised a daughter with integrity, even if they didn't demonstrate it themselves." That letter represented something I hadn't experienced in decades: recognition of my character and choices independent of my financial resources. For the first time, someone was acknowledging my worth as a person, rather than my usefulness as a funding source, and it came from a victim of my family's crimes, rather than someone seeking to benefit from my success. As I prepared to leave Dr. Torres's office after our session that day, she offered an observation that would stay with me for months. "You spent 30 years trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. Now you have the opportunity to build relationships with people who value you for who you are, rather than what you can provide. That's not just recovery from trauma. That's the foundation for a completely different kind of life." 9 months after their arrests, my family faced their final sentencing hearings in a federal courthouse packed with victims' media representatives and supporters who had followed their case through months of legal proceedings. The judge who would determine their sentences, the Honorable Rebecca Martinez, had a reputation for thoughtful but firm sentencing in white-collar crime cases, particularly those involving family financial abuse. The prosecution had recommended substantial prison sentences that reflected both the monetary damages and the psychological harm caused by their systematic deception. Tyler received his agreed-upon 12 years in federal prison, while prosecutors sought 8 years for Robert, 7 years for Patricia, and 5 years for Brianna, with restitution orders that would require them to repay every dollar they had stolen. But before sentencing, Judge Martinez required each defendant to participate in a victim impact session where they would hear directly from the people they had harmed. The courtroom felt heavy with emotion as victim after victim described how my family's fraud had affected their lives, their trust in others, and their financial security. Mrs. Henderson spoke first, her voice steady but sad as she described the $8,000 she had lent for fake medical expenses. "I've lived on Social Security for 15 years, she told the court. "That money represented 6 months of my grocery budget, given freely because I thought my neighbors were suffering. Learning it was spent on luxury vacations while they pretended to be grateful for my sacrifice has made me question every act of kindness I've ever offered." The elderly guests Tyler and Brianna had defrauded at Silverstone spoke next, describing not just their financial losses, but their violation of trust in what should have been a relaxing vacation experience. A retired couple from Los Angeles explained how the $5,000 they had paid for fake investment opportunities represented their anniversary celebration fund money they had saved for months to mark their 50th wedding anniversary. But the most powerful testimony came from members of their church congregation who had donated money for fabricated emergencies while struggling with their own financial challenges. A single mother described how she had given her children's Christmas money to help with Patricia's fake medical crisis, then worked double shifts to replace gifts she could no longer afford. "I taught my children that helping others was more important than material things," she said, tears streaming down her face. "When they asked why Santa brought fewer presents that year, I told them we had helped someone who needed our help more. Learning that their sacrifice funded someone's luxury vacation has shaken my faith in humanity." As victim after victim shared their stories, I watched my parents' faces for signs of genuine remorse or understanding. Patricia occasionally wiped away tears, but her expression remained focused on her own consequences rather than the suffering she had caused. Robert stared at his hands throughout most of the testimony, seeming more embarrassed by public exposure than genuinely sorry for his crimes. Brianna's reaction was the most disappointing because I had hoped she might show some insight into the magnitude of her betrayal. Instead, she maintained the victim persona her attorney had crafted, presenting herself as someone who had been manipulated by Tyler rather than an active participant in targeting innocent people for fraud. When Judge Martinez asked if any defendants wanted to address the court before sentencing, Patricia requested permission to speak. She stood slowly, her orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the elegant clothing she had worn while perpetrating her crimes, and delivered what sounded like a prepared statement designed to minimize her culpability. "Your Honor, I want to express my deepest regret for the poor decisions that brought us to this courtroom today." She began, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "My husband and I are simple people who got caught up in circumstances beyond our control. We never intended to hurt anyone, and we're deeply sorry for any pain we may have caused." The carefully worded apology avoided accepting responsibility for deliberate criminal behavior while painting them as victims of circumstances rather than architects of systematic fraud. There was no acknowledgement of the years of planning, the sophisticated deception, or the calculated exploitation of people who had trusted them. But Judge Martinez wasn't fooled by the performance. "Mrs. Hamilton, the evidence in this case shows years of systematic fraud against multiple victim categories, including family members, neighbors, religious organizations, and government agencies. This wasn't poor decision-making during a moment of crisis. This was a criminal lifestyle that funded luxury experiences while exploiting the kindness and trust of innocent people." When Robert was given the opportunity to speak, his statement was even more disappointing. Instead of accepting responsibility or expressing genuine remorse, he attempted to justify their crimes by claiming they had been driven by financial desperation and medical expenses that the evidence had already proven to be fabricated. "Oh, we're not criminals, Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying a tone of injured dignity that felt obscene in the context of his obvious crimes. "We're retired seniors who made mistakes during a difficult period of our lives. We hope the court will consider our age and health issues when determining our sentences." The audacity of claiming victimhood while surrounded by the people they had actually victimized represented everything that was wrong with their approach to accountability. Even facing federal prison sentences, they remained committed to the manipulation and deception that had defined their criminal behavior. Judge Martinez's response was swift and uncompromising. "Mr. Hamilton, you and your wife built a criminal enterprise that systematically targeted the most vulnerable members of our community, elderly neighbors, struggling families, and your own daughter who trusted you unconditionally. Your age doesn't excuse your crimes. It makes them more reprehensible because you use the respect society shows to seniors to facilitate your fraud. When Brianna was offered the chance to speak, her statement finally contained the first acknowledgement of genuine wrongdoing any family member had expressed. Your Honor, I know I made terrible choices that hurt people who didn't deserve it, she said, her voice barely audible. I was angry at my sister for things that weren't her fault, and I let that anger lead me into doing things I knew were wrong. I can't undo the damage I caused, but I want to accept responsibility for my actions and try to make amends if possible. The statement wasn't perfect. It still contained elements of excuse-making and deflection, but it represented the first acknowledgement from any family member that their crimes had been deliberate choices rather than unfortunate mistakes or misunderstandings. Judge Martinez delivered sentences that reflected both the seriousness of their crimes and the impact on their victims. Robert received 7 years in federal prison, Patricia received 6 years, and Brianna received 3 years, plus 2 years of supervised probation. All three were ordered to pay full restitution plus additional damages for the emotional trauma they had caused their victims. But beyond the prison sentences and financial obligations, Judge Martinez imposed conditions designed to prevent them from continuing their pattern of exploitation. They would be prohibited from accessing social media, requesting charitable donations, or representing themselves as financially needy for any purpose. Any future contact with victims, including me, would constitute a violation of their supervised release terms. As my family was led away to begin their prison sentences, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that I was still processing months later in therapy. There was satisfaction in seeing justice served and innocent victims receive acknowledgement of the wrongs committed against them. There was a relief that their criminal behavior had finally been stopped before they could hurt more people. But there was also profound sadness for the family relationships that could never be repaired and the trust that had been permanently broken. These were the people who had raised me, shaped my understanding of love and loyalty, and taught me important lessons about integrity and character, lessons they had apparently never learned themselves. The reckoning was complete, but the healing process was just beginning. For the first time in my adult life, I was free to build relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than financial obligation and emotional manipulation. It was a freedom that came at tremendous personal cost, but it was also the foundation for a life I had never imagined possible. 2 years after my family's sentencing, I stood in the transformed event space at Silverstone Resort, watching families participate in the first annual conference of the Family Financial Abuse Recovery Network. The resort that had once been the site of my family's criminal enterprise had become a healing center for people who had survived similar experiences, offering support resources and hope to victims of family financial abuse across the country. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After the criminal proceedings concluded, I had spent months working with therapists, legal experts, and victim advocacy organizations to develop a comprehensive program that addressed the unique challenges faced by people who had been financially exploited by family members. The resulting nonprofit organization provided counseling, legal assistance, and educational resources while advocating for stronger laws to protect victims of family financial abuse. Dr. Torres, who had become the program's clinical director, opened the conference by addressing the misconceptions that made family financial abuse so difficult to recognize and prosecute. Society teaches us that family relationships are sacred and that blood is thicker than water, she told the audience of survivors, supporters, and professionals. But when family members systematically exploit love and trust for financial gain, the bonds that should protect us become weapons used against us. The audience included people from across the economic spectrum who had been targeted by family members for their resources, their credit, their property, or their government benefits. There were elderly parents who had been defrauded by adult children, young adults whose families had destroyed their credit and financial futures, and successful professionals who had spent decades enabling family members' financial abuse while believing they were demonstrating love and loyalty. Among the speakers was Mrs. Henderson, who had become an advocate for elderly financial abuse victims after her experience with my parents. She had sued my parents for the money they had stolen and used the settlement to establish a fund that provided emergency assistance to seniors who had been defrauded by people they trusted. "I'm 78 years old and I thought I was too smart to be fooled by criminals," she told the audience. But family financial abuse is different from stranger fraud because it exploits our deepest emotions and most fundamental beliefs about love and obligation. Recovery requires not just getting our money back, but learning to trust our instincts about people who claim to care about us. The most moving presentation came from a panel of young adults whose families had exploited their credit and financial aid to fund parents' addictions, gambling debts, or lifestyle choices. These victims often faced years of damaged credit-ruined educational opportunities and complicated family relationships that made recovery particularly challenging. Sarah, who had become the organization's legal director after helping me navigate my family's prosecution, presented information about legislative efforts to strengthen protections for family financial abuse victims. Several states had passed laws making it easier to prosecute family members for financial crimes and providing victims with enhanced legal remedies for recovering stolen assets. The legal system has traditionally been reluctant to intervene in family financial disputes, Sarah explained, but we're beginning to recognize that family financial abuse is a serious crime that requires the same protections and remedies available to victims of other forms of fraud and theft. The conference also featured workshops on practical topics like rebuilding credit after family financial abuse, setting boundaries with manipulative family members, and recognizing the warning signs of financial exploitation before it escalates into serious criminal behavior. Mental health professionals provided guidance on healing from the trauma of betrayal by people who should have been sources of love and support. But for me, the most meaningful aspect of the weekend was meeting other survivors who had found ways to rebuild their lives after family financial abuse. Their stories reminded me that healing was possible, that trust could be rebuilt with the right people, and that the experience of being victimized didn't have to define the rest of our lives. Jennifer, who had remained as Silverstone's general manager, approached me during a break between presentations. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted you to know that hosting this conference has been incredibly meaningful for our entire staff," she said. "Seeing this property transformed from a site of criminal activity into a place of healing and education has been profoundly moving for everyone who worked here during your family's fraud." The resort's transformation had indeed been remarkable. The elegant spaces that had once hosted Tyler's fake investment seminars now welcomed support groups and educational workshops. The wine cellar where my family had stolen rare vintages was now used for fundraising events that supported victim services. The owner's suite, where they had hosted their criminal celebration, had become a retreat space for trauma counseling and intensive therapy programs. As the conference concluded, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me from being a victim of family financial abuse to becoming an advocate for other survivors. The experience had been devastating in many ways, destroying relationships I had thought were fundamental to my identity while forcing me to confront painful truths about the people I had loved most in the world. But it had also been liberating in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Free from the constant drain of manufactured emergencies and emotional manipulation, I had discovered reserves of energy and creativity that I hadn't known existed. My relationships with friends and colleagues had deepened as I learned to value genuine mutual support over the transactional exchanges that had defined my family interactions. Most importantly, I had learned that my worth as a person wasn't measured by my ability to solve other people's problems or fund their lifestyle choices. The love and respect I received from friends, colleagues, and romantic partners was based on who I was as a person, rather than what I could provide, creating relationships that were more satisfying and meaningful than any family bond I had ever experienced. The final presentation of the conference was a panel discussion about forgiveness and moving forward after family financial abuse. The conversation was nuanced and thoughtful, acknowledging that forgiveness could be part of the healing process for some survivors, while recognizing that ongoing relationships with abusive family members weren't necessary or advisable for everyone. Forgiveness isn't about excusing criminal behavior or exposing yourself to future abuse, explained Dr. Maria Santos, a trauma specialist who worked with family abuse survivors. It's about releasing the anger and resentment that can prevent you from building the life you deserve. You can forgive people while maintaining boundaries that protect you from further harm. As the weekend ended, participants exchanged contact information and made plans to continue supporting each other through ongoing recovery processes. The connections formed during the conference would become lasting friendships and professional relationships that extended the healing process far beyond the formal programming. For me, the conference represented not just a professional accomplishment, but a personal milestone in my recovery from family financial abuse. Standing in the resort that had once been the site of my family's betrayal, surrounded by other survivors who had found ways to rebuild their lives after similar trauma, I felt a profound sense of purpose and completion. The final evening of the conference included a fundraising dinner that raised over $200,000 for victim services and legislative advocacy. As I addressed the donors and supporters who had made the evening possible, I shared thoughts about the transformation that had brought me from victim to advocate. 3 years ago, I believed that love meant accepting abuse while providing unlimited financial support to people who exploited my generosity. I told the audience, "Tonight, I'm surrounded by people who value me for who I am, rather than what I can provide, and I'm working to prevent other families from experiencing the betrayal and trauma that nearly destroyed my life." The audience's response was overwhelmingly positive, but more important than their applause was the sense of community and purpose that filled the room. These were people who understood that family relationships should be sources of strength and support rather than exploitation and manipulation, and they were committed to creating a world where family financial abuse was recognized, prosecuted, and prevented. As the evening concluded, I walked onto Silverstone's terrace and looked out over the valley where my family had once celebrated their criminal success, while planning to steal even more from innocent victims. The view was the same, but everything else had changed. The site of their betrayal had become a place of healing, education, and hope for people who had survived similar experiences. My phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, my cousin, who had inadvertently helped expose my family's crimes by refusing to provide confidential banking information. He had become one of my closest allies during the recovery process, offering support and understanding as I navigated the complex emotions of holding family members accountable for serious crimes. "Watched your speech online tonight," his message read. "Your parents may have failed to teach you about integrity and character, but they couldn't destroy the person you chose to become. Proud to be your family now." The message captured something essential about the life I had built in the aftermath of my family's betrayal. While I had lost the relationships that had defined my early life, I had gained something more valuable: genuine connections with people who appreciated my character rather than exploiting my resources, professional relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation, and personal friendships that provided support during difficult times rather than creating additional stress and drama. The journey from victim to survivor, to advocate had been longer and more painful than I could have imagined when I first discovered my family's crimes. But it had also been more rewarding than I could have predicted, leading to work that gave my life meaning and relationships that provided genuine love and support. As I prepared to leave Silverstone that night, I felt grateful for the path that had brought me to this moment. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed my faith in family relationships had ultimately led me to discover what healthy family bonds actually looked like. Not transactions based on financial obligation and emotional manipulation, but connections based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared values. The resort that had once been the site of my family's criminal enterprise would continue serving as a healing center for survivors of family financial abuse, providing resources and support that would help thousands of people rebuild their lives after similar betrayals. It was a legacy I was proud of, transformation that honored the suffering of victims while creating hope for their recovery and future protection. Standing in the California evening air, surrounded by the peaceful beauty of wine country, under a canopy of stars, I felt something I had never experienced during my years of trying to earn my family's love, complete peace with the choices I had made, and excitement about the future I was building. The woman who had once measured her worth by her ability to fund other people's emergencies had become someone who valued herself for her integrity, her courage, and her commitment to protecting innocent people from the kind of predators who exploit family bonds for personal gain. It was a transformation that began with the decision to hold criminals accountable for their actions, even when those criminals happened to share my DNA. Have you ever had to choose between protecting yourself and maintaining family relationships that were harmful to your well-being? I'd love to hear your thoughts about setting boundaries with family members who don't respect your needs or values. Please share your experiences in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more stories about overcoming family challenges, and share this video with others who might benefit from hearing about the journey from victim to survivor. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but ultimately healing journey, and I hope my experience provides encouragement for anyone facing similar challenges with family relationships. Remember that you deserve love and respect that doesn't come with conditions or expectations, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is protect yourself from people who would exploit your kindness for their own benefit.